Hello again. Today, we shall be discussing about Estonia under Soviet control and the rough conditions that it brought. Yet, we won't be discussing it all, only the diplomatic side of the country and our economic state. After a brief period of freedom, Soviet control was reinstated in Estonia in 1944. Their first act was to instate the Estonian Communistic Party, its lead being the first secretary. The ECP's, Estonian Communistic Party, and Moscow's central government's will was fulfilled by the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, also known as Ensv. The higher-ups, that being the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic's Supreme Council, lacked such power, as most of it was owned by the earlier mentioned rung of power. The voting was strict, as in you could only vote for one candidate who had been greenlit by the higher-ups of the nation. The ECP and government was formed of mostly communists from the June Revolution, Estonians in Russia, and other people belonging to the Soviet powers. On top of that, over time the ECP's member count grew and grew up to a point where the party had the same amount of people as 10% of Soviet-controlled Estonia. In the early years of Soviet Estonia, the ECP was led by Nikolai Karodam, the first secretary. But Moscow being Moscow, they only trusted their own officials. So, Nikolai Karodam was accused of plenitude of wrongdoings, leading to his replacement in 1950 by Johannes Gabin. This was an important change, as for the first time there was a Russian Estonian in charge, and the leader of the ECP didn't even speak Estonian. Johannes Gabin was a lot more willing to do Moscow's bidding, while also listening to Estonia and Ensv's requests. Due to his skill of appealing to all, he retained his high position for a lengthy period of time. But in 1978, he was replaced by Karl Vaino, who was on Moscow's side fully, bringing a new wave of Russifying to Estonia, like the movement of Russian-speaking, which grew very active. The Joint Nations security agencies had a large role in both countries. In the following years, the country was kept under check by the People's Commissariat. This also led to the creation of the KGB in 1945. The KGB's to-do list was lengthy, having to monitor and control society constantly to curb any non-communistic plans. Hell, the KGB had so many things to do, they needed to constantly recruit more people, either via their own volition or by force, using threats or bribery to snoop on their close ones. On top of the KGB, the Soviet rule was immortalized by the army that was in Estonia. After the war, Estonia's army was at a peak, allowing Russia to use it as a means of crushing opposition to their rule. This, as some of you could guess, was not enjoyed by the local residents, forcing them to leave areas claimed by the military so that the land may be used for military purposes. This caused many altercations between the military and civilians in the early years of Soviet control. Lastly, the economic side of things. The Estonian economy had a strong baseline of agriculture and mineral mining based on the size of the local workforce, but this baseline was already being shifted under German rule and during the years after the war. The Estonian economy was industrialized and farming was no longer private, each person farming for their own good, but conjoined to serve one large entity. This also brought in a large amount of immigrant workers from other nations belonging to Russia, lessening the importance of Estonians. What it also brought along was a large amount of urbanization. For reference, in 1953, only around 50% of Estonians lived in cities, but in 1980, that number grew by 20% up to 70% of Estonians living in cities. This industrialism and urbanization also pushed a lot of Estonians out of certain cities and areas, like Ida-Virumaa. The Soviet rule was brutal for Estonia, and it brought along its fair hardships. But maybe one day, I can tell you about how we broke free from these communistic shackles. That's about it for today. See you next time.